ACDC, one of the most unique and successful bands in the history of rock music. From their humble beginnings in the remote Australian city of Sydney, over a 10-year period, the band's simple, infectious, take-no-prisoners rock sound conquered the world.
I think ACDC just gave gimmick-free rock and roll. Good gimmick-free rock and roll. That's what they were about. Good times, blistering chords, and just everyone having a bloody good time.
ACDC wanted the world. They wanted to be big everywhere. They wanted everyone to sort of know who they were. They were on a mission. They had the ambition and they had the determination to get there and to do it and make it work.
Set up by brothers Malcolm and Angus Young in the early 70s, the band did not hit their stride until the arrival of legendary frontman Bon Scott, a singer who would become one of rock's most enduring and unique icons.
Somebody asked him, "Are you AC or DC?" trying to joke, and "No, I'm the lightning flash in the middle." And that's exactly what he was. He was the fulcrum, he was the focus, he brought the whole thing together. When he arrived, suddenly, flash, everything fitted in.
He was a unique, he was one of the uniques, and he had an impishness about him, and he had a twinkle in his eye. Bon always had a twinkle in his eye, and he had that cheeky little smile. You just knew that if you spent some time with him, you were going to have some fun. Bon Scott was the real deal.
This is the story of ACDC's ascendance from Sydney pub rockers to a stadium rock phenomenon. The story of one band's determination to become rock and roll legends. In 1963, the Young family from Glasgow, Scotland, relocated to Sydney, a major city on the east coast of Australia. After passing through hotels in the centre of town, the family settled in the suburb of Burwood. It was here that Malcolm Young and younger brother Angus, the driving force behind rock Goliath ACDC, grew up. Angus was quickly enrolled in Burwood Public School, where he met Jeff Curtin and his brother David.
We first met Angus probably in about 1964, 1965 I think it was, at Burwood Public School. From there we actually used to go to their house after school to play. It's only a little house. It was near Burwood Police Station. I remember the mother. The mother was a really nice lady. We used to get up to a bit of mischief on weekends. We used to go to Strathfield. We had an old fruit shop down there where we used to go down there and buy fireworks. And I remember one time we went down there, I think we bought I don't know, we ended up with a box of cigars anyway. I think we all got a bit sick after that, having a few smokes. We never smoked cigars again after that.
On leaving Burwood Public School, both Angus and Malcolm attended the local Ashfield Boys High School. Here they met Steve Armstrong, with whom they formed a strong friendship.
I first met Angus and Malcolm at school in 1967, Ashfield Boys High School. We used to knock around together on the weekends with a whole group of us and just generally hang out and have a bit of fun. Malcolm, as a young boy at school, he was looked upon as being the, well, I thought he was the pretty boy of the two. He was a larrikin, but none of us had hope in hell of getting a girl when Malcolm was around because he got them all, and I mean all of them. Angus. Well, there was a young guy that, well, he obviously, he was a larrikin. That's the word I could use to describe him. He had attitude, and he had attitude with everybody, but a great guy. A great guy. I got the impression that he was always in the shadow of Malcolm, especially where the girls were concerned. But no, Angus had that real attitude and was not frightened to display it to anyone. Through the week, they would have to do their guitar lessons after school. We didn't see them after school. But on the weekends, yeah, they would come out. They'd catch the bus, I supposed. And they hung around with, there was quite a large group of us on the weekends, and they blended in very well. And they were just like, some of the boys, just mates. And it was great.
The The first member of the Young family to make his name in the music business was elder brother George, whose writing partnership with Harry Vander formed the backbone of the band The Easy Beats. This pop combo were having significant success while Malcolm and Angus were youngsters.
We were there when Vander and Young sort of came back from overseas, when they were The Easy Beats, came back from tour. Memories of them playing with our slot car track out the back of their house and having a good time when they came back from tour. And I remember Angus getting a nice Jaguar radio which had volume controls on the tyres and the channel changes. It was a beautiful gift that he got, amongst other things, but that was one that sort of stands out in mind. I've never seen anything like it before.
We all knew George was successful as part of the Easy Beats. I, for one, never got to meet George, but admired their music, loved their music. We didn't view Angus and Malcolm any differently because George was their older brother. We just treated Angus and Malcolm the same as you or I or anybody else.
Along with writing and production partner Harry Vander, George was to take a keen interest in his younger brother's music, both in their youth and in later life.
I think George was a very major influence on their career because, and I think their parents were too, because they used to say that guitar practice was a must after school, homework first and then guitar practice.
Well, it would have been very advantageous to have a brother like George Young, because Malcolm and Angus, of course, would have grown up as little kids with a genuine bona fide rock star as a brother. And not just that, but to have people like Stevie Wright coming around to the house and all the other members of the Easy Beats was just probably a normal way of life. Also, as far as ambition is concerned, it wouldn't have been foreign to them to have great ambitions because they'd seen it already demonstrated with George Young. So would have been very, very important in the formative years for sure.
There's quite an age gap between George Young and Angus and Malcolm Young. George had success in the 60s with the Easy Beats, Friday on My Mind. We're working with Harry Vander, whom he has formed a very successful production partnership with. And for Angus and Malcolm growing up and looking up to a brother, an older brother, considerably older brother, albeit, but still a sibling, who was already immersed in the music business, knew about the insights of the music business, gave them two key advantages. First of all, it gave them someone who encouraged them and didn't knock them down, as might have happened had they come from a family where nobody had had success as a musician. Secondly, it showed them the pitfalls, which was also quite crucial, because Malcolm especially is very shrewd. He's always been very much about keep an eye on everything, know where the money's going, make sure you take every step and every advantage going. So George Young's success, not just musically, but also in terms of the business, had a huge effect on Angus and Malcolm, and I think positively.
Malcolm soon joined his first band, the creatively named Velvet Underground. They began playing at several low-key gigs across Sydney.
I think for any successful musician or anyone successful in life, your first break is the most important. It gets you en route, gets you on the way. And for a musician, be it Malcolm Young, be it Angus Young, be it whoever, to get in a band and get out and play shows and tour proves one of two things. You've either got it or you haven't. And going on stage at an early age for Malcolm with the Velvet Underground, albeit it didn't have success particularly, but it was successful for Malcolm because it proved to him he could do it. He could get up there on stage and make things happen. So I think the spark was lit, and once the fire was burning, there was no way it was ever going to be put out.
Malcolm lost interest in the Australian Velvets and soon began forming his own band. Colin Burgess, previously the drummer for successful Australian band The Masters Apprentices, was one of the first to join.
Well, I first got involved with ACDC around about 73, I think it was. Yeah, 73. Before Christmas. And I had left a band called Masters Apprentices earlier on, which had lots of hits and so on so. And that's how I said, this guy called Alan Kissack rang me up and said, look, Malcolm Young wants to form a band. And I said, sure. I didn't, at the time, I didn't even know who Malcolm Young was, but as it goes down the line, it was George Young's brother, and who used to be in the Easy Beats, George and Harry. And so he said, come along for a rehearsal and see what you think. So I said, yeah, okay. So I went along and great, it sounded great. As a matter of fact, Malcolm played absolutely fantastic guitar because it was just a three-piece band and it was at the time.
Colin and bassist Larry Van Crete were in, and after the successful jam, the three-piece began looking for a singer. Enter Dave Evans.
Well, I first met Malcolm Young after I answered an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald. I had heard of Malcolm before. He'd been in a band called Velvet Underground, which was a Sydney band, but he left the band when I joined as singer. So I'd heard about Malcolm, and but then Velvet Underground broke up, and that's why I answered the ad in the paper. And when the voice on the other end of the phone asked who it was, I said Dave Evans, and he went, it's Malcolm Young. He'd heard about me, of course, from the boys in Velvet Underground, and he said, look, I've got a couple of guys here. I'm forming a rock band. Come over and we'll have a jam. So that's what happened. I went over to Newtown in Sydney, and I met the other two boys. One was Colin Burgess on drums. He'd been a big star with the Masters Apprentices in the 60s. And also Larry Van Crete. I didn't really know him. We jammed, and it was great. We all shook hands, and we had a band.
A week later, Malcolm introduced a fifth and final member to the band.
After we'd formed the band, Malcolm asked if Angus could audition for us. So Angus then auditioned for us. We still didn't have a name yet, by the way, the band. He auditioned for us, and of course there was no problem. He was a good player, same with Malcolm, and it was really a formality, really. Then there was 5 of us in the band.
The band began rehearsing regularly, and it was apparent to all that the group had potential.
Well, the dynamic of the band, right from the very word go, was very exciting. Even in the rehearsal room, a lot of energy. It just clicked straight away. And Malcolm got George Young to come and have a listen to us. It was exciting again for me. George Young from Easy Beats. That was, fantastic to meet George Young. George thought the band was great. It was just energy and power.
On December the 31st, 1973, ACDC played their debut gig at the Checkers Club in Sydney.
At the time, Checkers was the top nightclub in Sydney. And we got the very first gig there on New Year's Eve, I guess because of the personnel in the band. Colin Burgess, of course, and the 2 young brothers, brothers of George Young from Easy Beats. There was obviously great expectations that the band was going to be great, and we were. We just went on and just did what we did. It was fantastic, just blew them away. It was a fantastic beginning.
We were just running off songs like stuff from the Beatles and maybe Stones and a couple of others. It's a long time ago. But it was mainly covers. We might have did a couple of original songs in there. It's a long time ago.
It's really part of Australian rock anyway. You've got to go out there from the very word go and just hit them between the eyes of the crowd. You've got to really hit them, but you've got to maintain that all through the set. In fact, towards the end of the set, you've actually got to crank it up. It's sort of like a blitzkrieg, if you know what I mean. And that is part and parcel of what Australian rock's all about.
Actually, it went pretty well, considering, because playing covers and things like that, because that's what the crowd know. If the crowd doesn't know any of your songs, you might as well be playing to nobody because they've never heard the songs before. So if you've got people that are there for New Year's Eve, they've got to know the songs that you're playing. If they can't know the songs you're playing, why do it? So it's to get them up dancing. It takes a while to get a band established because you've got to keep on going until you do. So it made us establish itself. So through Checkers, which was quite good. So that was that.
The band was given a residency at Checkers and also began to play all across Sydney. They soon gained a reputation as one of the best rock and roll acts in the area.
With Australian bands, we're so far away from the rest of the world. And the main influences, of course, were English bands or British bands and American bands. And I guess Australians just realised we've got to try harder because we had all the top acts from the world coming out to Australia, impressing the Australian public, and being local boys, we knew we were just as good or better than these guys, but we had to go out and prove it. So the crowds were very sceptical. They'd seen all the great stars coming out here playing at Festival Hall, and so our attitude as Australian rockers was to get out there and absolutely blow them away.
ACDC are a live band, always have been, always will be. That's what their forte was, that's what their forte is. They go out there and however good the records are, they sell themselves on stage. And they knew from the start, if we're going to make it in Australia, we have to be seen on stage because that's where we can make things work.
Well, the set when we first started was mostly Chuck Berry, 12-bar type rock and roll, some Rolling Stones, Free, but also there was a couple of original numbers that Malcolm had written, and also we used to jam. Sometimes if we didn't have enough numbers, Malcolm would just say, right, we're doing this in E or A or G or whatever. I could sing any keys, it didn't matter. Just follow me. And he'd just start a riff, any riff, and the band would follow in, and I'd just make up the lyrics and the song on the spot. And a couple of those we did keep, although they were never recorded. So yeah, from like Rolling Stones, Free, as I said before, Chuck Berry, and one or two Malcolm songs, and making songs up on the spot. That's how we started.
By this time, George Young and Harry Vander were working for Albert Productions, a newly formed record company. In June 1974, they decided to take ACDC into EMI Studios to record and produce the band's first single.
Recording Can I Sit Next to You Girl was a very exciting moment for me. I remember getting the bus from Bondi into the city. We're all broke, of course, in those days, just getting the bus in there to EMI Studios because that's where it was recorded. I was sitting on the bus with people around me. I just wanted to tell everybody that I was going to record a single, but obviously you can't. I was so excited. It was the first time I'd ever been in a studio too. So I really didn't say much. Harry Vander and George Young were there with the boys and Colin and that kind of stuff, and my eyes were quite wide, and I was very, very excited. It was all new, all foreign to me, and I virtually just did what I was told.
The first record was completed. With Can I Sit Next to You Girl, the band believed they had a hit on their hands.
I thought that it's got great potential, especially after starting to get into the original stuff. I thought, great, because I've been in a band that had played original stuff and had quite a few hits, lots of hits, and I thought, here we go again, it's on another roll. So yeah, I knew they were going to be big, and they were.
The first single, Can I Sit Next to You, was very early ACDC. It was very much finding their feet. You can hear the genesis and the germ of the sound we know and love today and would make them into megastars, but it's very much in the early days. And I think Harry Vander and George Young being there as producers, co-producers, helped and hindered. Helped in the way that because they knew their way around the studio, they could bring out certain things and make certain suggestions. I think it hindered because AC/DC was still a little confused as to where they were going musically. And what Vander and Young did almost is accentuate the confusion. So while they were expert and prolific in the studio, what they didn't seem to actually appreciate right then was letting AC/DC be themselves. So they were adding to the confusion by adding in ideas. So you end up with a good song, but doesn't really have much impact because it's not well presented. Not talking about production, I'm talking about presentation, arrangement. It's something they learnt very fast, though.
Despite the imminent release of their debut single, there were growing tensions within the band, and conflicts occurred.
The first casualty, I suppose, of AC/DC was Colin Burgess. Colin, at this stage, wasn't very popular with Angus and Malcolm Young. He'd been a great star in the 60s, etc., and was very popular with the girls. We'd arrive at places and Colin would have a girl on each arm and this kind of stuff, and I thought it was great. And But Malcolm and Angus would talk behind his back and call him rock star and pop star and that kind of thing. They were very, very jealous of Colin. One night when we were playing at Checkers, Colin just seemed out of sorts, really. I don't know what was wrong with him. But during the set, Colin did this big drum roll and just kept going with the drum roll and landed flat in his face on the stage beside the drummers.
One night I come along there and I had a couple of drinks beforehand. I mean, I wasn't drunk. I mean, I've never fallen off my drums in all my life, and I never have and I never will again. No, what actually happened, I come along and I bought a drink and I left it on the table and I went behind to go and have a check and see what my drums were set up for the night, etc. And I come back about, I don't know, half an hour later on, and I grabbed my drink because we were just about to go on, and I sculled this drink. I thought, okay. So we go on, and we're on stage, and all of a sudden, just, my head's going woo, 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 and it flipped me out. And I thought, I sort of turned into jelly. It was like, and I just did around this roll and kept going. As if you talk to Andy Evans, he'll say the same thing. I did this long roll around the kit, kept on rolling and bloop and roll onto the floor. We
called a halt to the set. Obviously, we didn't have a drummer. We carried Colin off the stage, and I was worried. I didn't know what happened. 10 minutes later or so, Malcolm walked up to me and informed me he'd sacked him.
Quite obviously, it was that Malcolm said, "Oh, okay, you're so drunk you can't play, so you got the sack." So, well, I had to sit down for a while when I come off stage because I was like jelly. I mean, it was either a trip or something gave me something in my drink. But whether Angus and Malcolm will say that, I probably won't say that because, who knows what they'll say.
I was shocked, when it did happen. Yeah, I was in shock. Sure, I like Colin, I still do, but he was sacked, and that was the portent of things to come. Believe me.
With a newly recruited rhythm section, the band went on the road to promote the single. It was decided, however, that a change of image was needed to separate ACDC from their contemporaries.
Malcolm and Angus informed the rest of us that Angus was going to be dressed in a schoolboy uniform, short pants and the rest of it, and Malcolm was going to wear a sort of a white silk airman's jumpsuit with blue sort of gumboot type things, and he asked the rest of us if we can think of something. So the drummer at the time, Noel Taylor, came up with an idea of wearing sort of a harlequin sort of clown outfit with a top hat. The bass player, Neil Smith, came up with a New York cop sort of outfit with a crash helmet, jodhpurs and dark glasses, that kind of stuff. And I came up with the idea of the ultimate parody of a rock star, I guess. It was a cross between Rod Stewart and his jackets and stuff like that, and Slade. So when we actually went out at Victoria Park there in Sydney, the big open air concert, the fans that were out there knew what we were like. They'd seen us, but when we walked out, the reaction was quite amazing, to tell you the truth. Schoolboy uniform and the rest of us, we played the same music, obviously. It had a great reaction, and the schoolboy uniform seemed to do something to Angus Young because he really ripped up the stage. He just went berserk. I'd never seen him like that before. After we'd been gigging for a few months with this look, another band in Australia came out called Skyhooks, and they had weird gear on too, clown outfits and all that kind of stuff. Although their music was not as hard-hitting and heavy as what we were doing. And I guess that's why Malcolm then said, right, we're all going back to jeans and T-shirts again, except for Angus. Angus will keep his schoolboy uniform, and that'll make the difference between us and any other band around the place.
Malcolm's decision to make Angus the focal point of the band didn't end with his brother's stage attire.
Malcolm was really, I suppose, the brains, I guess, of ACDC, and Malcolm was also instrumental in putting Angus forward as the star, as it were, because when we first started, we did a lot of 12-bar, and Malcolm and Angus both played lead. Malcolm was a great player. So we had two guitarists in the band. We were on tour and Malcolm one day said, "Look, I'm not playing lead anymore. Angus can do all the lead."
Initially, when ACDC formed, and we're talking about 31 years ago now, I feel they probably were seen as no more than just another bunch of kids trying to make it on the local scene. Nothing more than that. It's only when changes started to happen and they got the right lineup together that the sparks started to fly. I think in the early days, it was very much a local band, another stepping stone for Malcolm, with Angus, driving Angus along. The most important thing as far as that is concerned is it got Malcolm and Angus together in a band and proved that these two had something special. And you talk to people around at the time and say, band weren't exactly great. Wrong singer, Dave Evans, who was the original vocalist, wasn't fantastic. But Malcolm and Angus had something, especially Angus, because Angus was already developing his stage act. He was developing the famous walk, and suddenly people were looking at him and not at Dave Evans.
Evans was growing restless. It seemed to him that his role in the band was being undermined, and arguments inevitably occurred.
We formed the band as a band, and it was a democratic thing, like with the name of the band and all this kind of stuff. And by this time, with people being sacked left, right and centre, and also our first manager, he got sacked as well, I was feeling, I suppose, as a founding member, I wasn't being consulted with a lot of different decisions, which was quite upsetting, to tell you the truth. I guess I let my feelings known too, to Angus and Malcolm, who would, at this stage, would be having meetings with George Young and just virtually telling me what decisions.
It became apparent to Evans that on closer inspection, there were more young brothers in the band than there appeared to be.
I guess George, with his experience, really was the mentor for Malcolm and Angus, and really, I suppose, the unofficial manager. I mean, I didn't really worry about that. I mean, the experience of George Young was fantastic to draw upon. But, as I say, it became like a clique, of course, with the young brothers, and I realised by this stage that they expected everybody to toe the line of all decisions, and if you're a creative person yourself, or you're young and full of spunk and all that kind of stuff, and fire in your own belly and that kind of stuff, yeah, it does piss you off. I don't care what decisions were made, but it would have been respectful if I was at least sitting at the table, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Unbeknown to Evans, however, a new character was about to emerge who would change ACDC's path significantly.
Bon arrived and suddenly it all fell into place. The spark lit, the bulb went on and the fire started to rage.
The Scott family moved from Scotland to Australia in 1952. After settling briefly in Adelaide, they soon relocated to Fremantle, a quiet port south of Perth in Western Australia. Here, young Bon Scott was enrolled in the North Fremantle Primary School, where he befriended Ian Cant, a local boy who has kept close relations with the Scott family to this day.
Well, I first met Bon when we went to primary school together in North Fremantle. Living in North Fremantle back in those times was a great place to grow up, and I'm glad that I was born in North Fremantle. I was born in a hospital at the top of Harvest Road. It was a great place to live in, and it was a great place for Bon to grow up in.
To grow up around Fremantle, I reckon you were privileged, to be a Fremantleite, and that's what people call themselves, who live and brought up around Fremantle and still do. It's an atmosphere and an environment that really encourages people to enjoy themselves. And we certainly did back in the 60s in those days.
Bon, to me, was a little bit of a larrikin, full of life. Bon had an aura, and that showed up from a very early age. He had something that attracted people to him. He had an easygoing nature.
After leaving North Fremantle Primary, both Bon and Ian became students at the local John Curtin High School.
It was a good high school to go to. Yes, it was. It was a very good high school. The teachers were good. The environment was good. And all the students at that time, it was a fun period in his life and my life. High school was a good time. Yes, it was.
Bon developed an interest in drumming and played with his father Chick in the Fremantle Pipe Band. In his mid-teens, Bon became more interested in rock and roll and began to hang out at the local dances. Here he met Richard Selby, who shared his passion for music and would later become the singer of the Perth band The Troubadours.
I first met Bon, it was probably at St Patrick's Church. They used to have a Sunday dance, a rock and roll dance on a regular basis. And there'd be bands coming, and I was a young high school student going to John Curtin High School in Fremantle, same as Bon. And we used to go to St Pat's on a Sunday, and on a Friday we'd go to the Fremantle Police Boys, and they'd have wonderful rock and roll bands on, and we'd be there watching the bands. There was always something happening in Fremantle with rock and roll, and I think that was a good part of our growing up. Before we actually got into bands, that was influencing us at the time. We'd go and watch the other bands, and that'd encourage us to practice a little bit more, try a little bit harder, and try and form our own bands.
Bon soon joined his first group, the Spectors, a cover band in which he was the drummer and occasional singer. They began to play the same dances in which he'd previously been a member of the audience.
In 1964, I joined the Troubadours, and it must have been about the same time the Spectres were happening. And I think we played a couple of gigs together at a place called the Big Beat Centre in Anzac House in Perth. And that moved later out to Victoria Park in Albany Highway. And I remember the Spectres, but I'm not sure of the venues. I think it was the Big Beat Centre where we'd share the gigs, and along with other bands like Russ Kennedy and the Little Wheels, and I think Johnny Young and the Strangers, and the better Perth bands that love the rock and roll and are playing good rock and roll.
It was in this lively music scene that Bon first met Vincent Lovegrove, lead singer with rival band The Winstons.
I first met Bon in 1964-65, and he was in a band called the Spectres. He mostly played drums. The lead singer then was a guy called John Collins. And Bon used to get up and sing maybe 3 or 4 songs a night. We often as not found we were playing at the same venues. And he and I struck up a friendship. The scene in Perth, Australia at that particular time was, there was a lot of cabarets, and they had what they call corkage fees, where you brought your alcohol to a club, which were open till 3 a.m, and you paid for your corkage and they would store your alcohol. That's how they got around the licensing laws. There was also a lot of mining going up in the north of Australia at that stage, places like Mount Tom Price. And the miners used to work on and off. They'd work for 6 months and take 3 months off, and they'd accumulate a lot of cash, and they came down to Perth and would spend it in these clubs. The only problem was, and of course they had lots of entertainment there, the only problem was the bands that they wanted to have there were primarily what we called top 40 cabaret bands. In other words, what they did was their repertoire belonged to the top 40 charts and what you heard on radio. There was no originality then. So therefore there was a lot of places that opened up in the surf clubs along the west coast. One we played at a lot was at a place called Swanbourne, and they were called Stomps.
On leaving school, Bon became a postman, delivering mail by day and playing concerts by night.
I met Bon at Fremantle Post Office in late 1967. We were postmen together. Bon was, laughing all the time and, generally having a good time. But, with Bon, it was something like 2 lives. He'd come to work, but he'd virtually have his clothes on that he'd been working on at night, not have his uniform on. He'd just say where he'd been playing and where he was going to play and that type of thing. He actually said to us, why don't you come and see us some night when we're playing? So, we went to, I think it was Swanbourne Beach down there when he played at the Swanbourne Stomp down there. But we used to go, my mates and I used to go to different stomps around the area, and he happened to be in one of them. Swanbourne was the main one. He had a very good personality. He was a likeable chap and easy to get on with. So his personality, I'd say, was at the time better than his singing. But in the end, he was more known for his singing than his personality. But I think he had both, and that was one of his pluses.
In the end, it was Bon's friendship with Vince Lovegrove that proved to be the most fruitful for his career and turned him from a drummer into a frontman.
I suggested to him one time that he should, sing more rather than play drums, but it wasn't his band. The band was led by John Collins, and he was the man, he was the singer, and there wasn't any way that Bon was going to make it to be full-time singer of that band. And because both of the bands were in competition, it was a very competitive field at that time, I suggested to Bon that we join ranks and form one band and have 2 lead singers.
The Valentines were born and soon developed into the biggest gigging band in Perth.
My skin is green, but the trees are pink. For colours they don't mean.
In particular, the distinctive teaming of the 2 charismatic frontmen set the band apart from their contemporaries.
They're both pretty smooth back in those days when I come to think about it. But Vince was more laid back, obviously, than Bon because of the personality. And Vince had this aura of, this star aura, whereas Bon had this mischief, this thing about him, this twinkle in his eye, this look on his face that would sort of bounce off Vince. Vince was the cooler one, and it was most interesting to see that.
The main reason we did it was because probably both of us weren't really confident enough to lead a band on our own, and we worked off each other a lot. We had a pretty wild stage act for the time. We should jump up on amps and have fire bombs going off on stage, and all sorts of weird stuff. And we fired off each other. We definitely gelled, and we'd work out stuff beforehand, what we would do and what we wouldn't do.
With the Spectres and the Valentines, which came along a little bit later, and the Valentines were a fusion of the Spectres and Vince Lovegrove's other band, I think they were called the Winstons, but they also came out of another thing that was kind of influential in Australia, which European people would recognise, was that whole instrumental rock tradition of like the Shadows. And so in Perth in the early 60s, you had what were called stomps. That was like dances that surfies went to, because there's a big surf scene. There's great beaches over there. And so there was a bit of that Shadows sound that was like surf music sort of coming in a bit. And the kids, these were just teenage boys taking on electric guitars because they saw Hank Marvin doing it. And the Beatles come along and they got long hair and they're singing. So the Australian groups, and particularly in Perth, be really isolated, really just making up the rules for yourself, because there were absolutely no parameters or no possibilities. It's just a whole new thing.
The Valentines entered the recording studio and began to release singles across Australia. This brought them to the attention of George Young and Harry Vander, who enlisted them to support the Easy Beats on tour in Perth. Yet, despite their success, they couldn't afford to give up the day jobs.
Bon used to be a postman, and I worked at a place called Palouse Menswear in Fremantle. He was a postie in Fremantle, so on his rounds he'd drop mail off to Palouse Menswear, where I worked, and we'd go out and have a drink, or we'd go around the corner and have a snort of speed or whatever, and we'd go back to our respective jobs. And he during the daytime, we saw each other. We'd have lunch together or, you know, whatever. He'd come, as soon as he came around to Palouse, that was when I would knock off and take some time off, whether it was lunch or afternoon tea, morning tea, and we'd go and dream our dream of what we're going to do, what the next move was going to be, and what we're going to do next. And that's when we concocted the plan, well, you know, let's get out of here, let's go over to Melbourne.
The Perth music scene was getting too constraining for the Valentines, and they decided to enter a Battle of the Bands competition, with the first prize a trip to London.
It was a nationwide competition, so each state would have their own mini Battle of the Bands, and we won Perth's Battle of the Bands, and our prize was to go to Melbourne. Not to London, but to go to Melbourne to compete in the National Battle of the Bands. Well, that was a big trip for us. We thought that was, you know, the best thing that ever happened. So we decided to use that as our gauge as to whether or not we would leave Perth. We went over, and of course we played in a big hall. There was 5,000 screaming fans. There was another 12 bands on, or 11 bands on. It was incredible. You only did 2 songs. You know, you could work out a great set with 2 songs, great stage act, great, you know, everything was great. We went on there. We didn't win. But what we did do during the 3 or 4 days we were there was go to every single club in Melbourne and see that it was a completely different world to where we came from in Perth. So we decided there and then, okay, this is it, let's go, let's come over here. So we went back home and worked towards going over, and it was about 6 months later that we left to go to Melbourne.
The move to Melbourne was timely. Not only was the city's music scene more advanced, it allowed the band to put their talent to the test as professional musicians.
They went to Melbourne from Perth, and Melbourne was the pop capital where you had Go Set magazine and sort of TV shows like Commotion, and all this stuff was happening there. And bands like the Valentines, even a third level ordinary band could be doing 3 gigs a night, because you do a suburban dance hall and a city nightclub and whatever. And so what that is, that was the thing that still does make Australian bands great, is that ability to play, is just play on stage to people. And I think that was the training ground there. If you've got 3 gigs a night, you've got to get reasonably adept, you know.
When we hit Melbourne, we made a band decision, you know, it was a band rule that, and it was a very democratic band, but as anybody will tell you, any democratic band always has trouble and isn't really democratic in the end. You know, the singers really run the show. And we made a pact in the band that we weren't going to do what everyone else was doing at that stage, which is, you know, 66. And that was take drugs and smoke pot. And I can remember Bon and I, when we went up to Sydney one time, and it was the first time either of us had ever had a joint, you know, late in the piece. It wasn't around when you were 15, 16 in those days. We were 20, 21. We went up to Sydney and, you know, we went and saw this band that we knew, and the keyboard player invited us back to his place to smoke some dope, you know, and it was the first time, and we were both nervous as shit. And we went back there and we smoked and got completely out of our head, and we were just shit scared in the corner of the room, giggling and wondering whether we should be there. And eventually we just slid our way out of the room, completely paranoid, and ran down, bursting out laughing, and went back to the hotel, to the one room that we were staying at. It was a hotel called the Crest Hotel in King's Cross, which no longer exists. It's been pulled down, but we went back there. And of course the band knew immediately that we'd smoked, and we got ostracised and told we were going to be kicked out of the band, right, which we completely laughed about and went and celebrated and went to a club and got shit-faced drunk, because we thought the gall of the band thinking that they could throw us out of the band. And we always used to have breakfast around the corner. We used to go around there, and they used to have fresh orange juice, and we went round there, and we'd always go there because after a hard night's drinking it's good to have a bit of orange juice. So we went round there, and we were in one table and the band was on the other table, and they wouldn't speak to us because we'd smoked dope, and we were still stoned, you know, we were still stoned. And anyway, eventually what happened was a member of the band came over and said, well, you know, it's okay, we'll let you go this time and we'll let you back into the band. And it was just a funny thing, you know.
Despite continued singles success, over the next 2 years the cracks began to show. A very public drugs bust resulted in unwanted press attention, and the light naivety of the Valentines' early image became tainted.
Bon and I started talking about, you know, we're going nowhere. We tried it out for 6 months, but we just, you know, we were only being kept alive by publicity about pot, not by what we were doing, which was good, but we weren't playing at the right places, and, you know, we got lost, basically. And so we got together, Bon and I, and decided that, and we felt we had the right to do it because we formed the band in the first place, that we would leave the band and that we'd get on with our other things. And, you know, we announced it to the band. It didn't go down all that well, obviously, with them or with our management at that stage. But we felt it was for the best.
Whereas Lovegrove moved into music journalism, Bon continued his dream for stardom and joined Fraternity, a heavyweight hippie group modelled on Robbie Robertson's The Band.
Bon had found his niche, you know, that was what he needed, and Bon was what they needed because he was a front man, and he became, when he left us, he became a showman. He learnt from us, from the Valentines, and no question about that. He'd had, virtually, 10 years being a showman up front, and he was what they needed as well. He was a front man with a good voice.
This is the only surviving footage of a documentary Lovegrove produced on Fraternity in 1972.
They believed that they were the best band in the world. They were, again, going to conquer the world. And it was also a time of many magic mushrooms being dropped and lots of alcohol being drunk. And that became part of Fraternity as well, without a doubt. And they were pretty heady times.
Fraternity aspired to that thing that the band had, the band that backed Bob Dylan. They had the big pink up at Woodstock. Well, Fraternity got their own little house in the hills, and they, as far as I can tell, sat around, got stoned and jammed, and that's like about it. They made a few sort of half-assed records in terms of, they cobbled them together and sort of got them out, and they had this kind of cult reputation, but really they had some potential which was kind of squandered by being in Adelaide and whatever, and then they went to the UK, and that's where, they were lost, and they completely lost it, and it just fizzled out.
Bon's first trip to England in 1972 was a disaster. Fraternity failed to grab the attention of the British public, and it would prove fatal to the band.
It was a pretty hard experience, I think, for every member of that band. Bon had just got married to Irene, so the whole band, including the dog and all the wives, it's just this wastrel hippie tribe, and that was just infighting in a small house and going and just seeing that it's not going to land in your lap. You can land in the UK and you're not going to be Jethro Tull overnight.
Bon returned to Australia broke. A second band had fallen apart, and he began drinking heavily. He became a makeshift member of the Mount Lofty Rangers, if only to pass the time until a more appropriate band appeared. Yet danger loomed on the horizon.
It was during a rehearsal one night that Bon got really drunk after having an argument with a member of the band. I think it was actually the old bass player of Fraternity. I could be wrong on that one. Got very drunk. He used to drink a lot of brandy straight from the bottle, and decided to get on his Harley motorbike and scream off to see someone. He was in a really foul mood. The thing about Bon was, as anybody who knows him well, is he could turn very quickly. He could turn, into a really bad mood, an aggressive mood. Anyway, he ripped off on his Harley-Davidson bike into the darkness of the night. And later on that night, and the night went on, later on that night, around about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call from Irene, his wife, saying, "Vince, can you come and pick me up? Bon's been in an accident, he's nearly dead."
Despite several injuries, Bon Scott survived. During his long recovery, he stayed with Vincent Lovegrove, who is now working as a booker for clubs in Adelaide.
Bon was recovering from this motorcycle accident he'd had early in 1974, almost killed, a terrible accident. And it was through the recovery period, because he was in hospital for a long time. I used to like to compare this to Bob Dylan's motorcycle accident, a bit like that. Bon was reflecting on what's he going to do with his life. Fraternity had broken up. His marriage had broken up. He was leaning on Irene, his wife, a bit, and there was a bit of feeling there. But he just knew that he had to do something.
At that stage, I was booking a very young band from from Sydney called ACDC. I used to book ACDC a lot, mainly because their mentor and big brother, George, who Bon and I had befriended during our Valentine's days when they were in the Easy Beats. And George and I remained, I wouldn't say friends, but certainly acquaintances. One time, after they'd been down 4 or 5 times, George gave me a call and said, you know, what happened to the money that the boys got last time? They didn't get any. And I said, well, I gave it to their manager. And he said, well, listen, do me a favour, he's going to get the sack. Next time they're over, give it to Malcolm. He's the man you give the cash to now. And he said, by the way, do you know any singers around? Because we're going to sack the singer as well.
Vince could think of only one suitable replacement, and Bon Scott's years in the wilderness would soon be at an end. Vince took Bon to see the young band at a gig in Adelaide.
I was enthusiastic. I really wanted him to get in the band. I was really enthusiastic. We were out the front looking at the band, and I said, what do you think? They're great, aren't they? And he said, well, they're all right, but, you know, they're only kids, they're a bit young, aren't they? And I said, yeah, but, you know, just listen, they really rock. They've got that Chuck Berry thing, they've got that Stones thing, you know, they're going to do it. He said, oh, yeah, I think they'll do it. But he said, I'm just not sure, you know, would they have anything to you know, have any common ground? He said, you know, I've got a bit more experience than they have. I said, OK, well, you know, let's go back and meet them. And I went back and we met them. And prior to that, I'd mentioned to them, I was backstage and mentioned to them and said, you know, they said, well, come on, Vince, have you got a singer? And I said, yeah, you know, what about Bon? And they said, oh, he's a bit old, isn't he? And I said, mate, he'll rock the arse off you guys. Make no mistake about that. And they said, oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, Malcolm and Angus were kids then, as you know, I wasn't much older, but the reality is that I knew it'd fit. I knew it'd fit. And so they went back that night to the house of the bass player of Fraternity in his basement, and they jammed and they did, you know, Chuck Berry songs, and they did just 12-bar rock and roll songs, and they gelled. And they were up all night. The next day, Bon came home, came in, packed his bag, and I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to Sydney. And I said, what are you going up there to live? And he said, no, I'm joining the band.
Bon returned to Sydney with the band, and while they waited for an appropriate time to sack Dave Evans, he got to know the various members well.
Bon was a funny guy. He's very cheeky, always laughing, always joking, live wire, nice bloke. Yeah, he was fun to have around, Bon.
Evans's days were numbered, and it was at the Hotel Esplanade in Melbourne that the final confrontation occurred.
Yeah, the last gig at the Esplanade Hotel in St Kilda was difficult. I knew we were having the meeting that night. I'd almost decided that I was going to split with the band anyway. I'd had enough at that stage. And I spent that afternoon with 2 friends of mine who were trying to talk me out of leaving the band. We did the gig. No one really spoke to each other. I wasn't speaking to the roadies. It was pretty solemn, to tell you the truth, except when we were on stage, of course. We did our act as we always do. That's being professional. But yeah, the air was thick and heavy, I can tell you. And then after the gig, we just went back to the hotel, and it was all over, for me.
My feeling with ACDC and the whole frontman scenario at the time was they knew Dave Evans wasn't quite right. They knew they had to make a change. Their big fear was throwing him out and not being able to find anybody else. So I think they bumbled along with him, hoping either he would suddenly improve, which was unlikely, or that they'd meet the right guy. And Bon Scott appeared. They knew he was the right guy.
Bon took over and brought vitality and vigour to a band that had yet to find its feet. It was soon apparent to all that the decision to recruit the more mature frontman was crucial.
Bon Scott became the heart and soul of ACDC. He once said, and I think he was probably right, somebody asked him, are you AC or DC, trying to joke? He said, no, I'm the lightning flash in the middle. And that's exactly what he was. He was the fulcrum. He was the focus. He brought the whole thing together. When he arrived, suddenly, flash, everything fitted in.
It had to happen. It couldn't not happen, because it was too perfect. The dovetail was too perfect. I mean, ACDC were not necessarily the most open-minded group of people, but when Bond stepped into that breach, it was clear. They couldn't fight it even if they wanted to, because he was the perfect guy that was going to do it. And same for Bond. Had Bond not encountered ACDC, God knows. I mean, I hate to think that he would have been, wallowing in the traps in the early 80s, flogging some blues rock band. That's a terrible thought too. He was too good for that.
The band decided to relocate to Melbourne and in their house in St Kilda began to work on fresh material that would utilise their new singer.
ACDC upping sticks and moving from Sydney to Melbourne was crucial. Now, the feeling was that they weren't getting far enough, quickly enough in Sydney. They'd probably reached the stage where they'd hit a ceiling, playing the same clubs to the same old people and blah-de-da-de-da. It no longer had an impact for them. They weren't moving forward. Moving to Melbourne opened things up. It seemed to be much more of a cosmopolitan city, more places to play, and they were playing to people who didn't know who they were, and they were better at it. They'd learnt their chops in Sydney, so they went to Melbourne as a decent band, not as a new bunch on the block trying to sort of make a first impact. They had made that first impact. They had confidence. It showed on stage. And suddenly people were saying, that lot, they're rather good.
After further intensive touring, in February 1975, ACDC released their debut album. Cut in 10 days, High Voltage killed off memories of their previous glam incarnation. It was all-out rock and roll.
Well, the Australian High Voltage is a bit of a patchwork. It was done very fast because budgets were like that. They didn't have a huge budget. They didn't have 10, 12 months to play with. They had to go in, get it done and get out. And I think it sounds on occasion like it's a rushed record. It's almost like a demo. We now have an album of our songs. Let's see and assess strengths and the weaknesses. So while it was commercially released, I think they treated it very much as an assessment of where they are and how they were going to get further.
I think High Voltage kind of gave them the taste of things to come, and I think that they were hungry for it. And Australia at the time was very hungry for a band like them, because you've got to remember at the time there was, if you go back to kind of late 60s, there was, artists around like Normie Rowe and Masters Apprentices, and but we didn't get bands like Cream touring, or we didn't get Deep Purple touring. We were kind of barren in that sense as far as rock was concerned. And then you had bands on the flip side like Little River Band, for instance, that so weren't, going to quench the rock appetite that Beer Swilling Australia at the time definitely had. Foster's cans in one hand, VB in the other, singlets, Marlboro Lights. I think ACDC filled that void in Australian rock suburbia that was so needed at the time.
High Voltage was just raw, timeless, basic rock and roll, and it didn't need glitter or stack heels, and it still stands up fantastically well. Even as the band was still embryonic, you can actually see the joins in that record, the way they're starting to figure out how to write songs with Bon Scott. This is the thing. Bon had come in and he's got his little notebooks and he's got ideas, he's got narrative stories. There's even the sort of a bit of a suggestion that he'd started to write in the latter fraternity days, but because that was much more of an intellectual kind of band, that his songs weren't going to work for them. But so Bon came into the band with, if not ideas, he had the real urge to express himself, and he's just a master wordsmith. So Malcolm and Angus get this guy who's going to give them this focus to work around and shape things, and then you got George. This is the whole thing. George wasn't going to polish a turd, but he was always going to be able to give it the dynamic shape, just help the band shape songs, make sure it's got the crunch in it, and just get that down. He didn't have to make slick records. That was anathema. They wanted to make dirty, raw records. So doing it in sessions between live gigs over 10 days sort of makes sense too. That's how most Australian bands made records in those days.
ACDC were off the starting blocks. They soon changed their lineup again, recruiting Phil Rudd on drums and Mark Evans on bass. As a band, they became more honed, and on stage their performance was electric. Bon in particular was developing into an iconic performer, and his true character was showing through at last.
Bon Scott was the first rock and roll non-sex symbol. That's what he was. He had a hairy chest, he had a beer gut, he had really bad hair, you know, completely unattractive. But there was something so lovable about him. You know, he was that lovable rogue, and you couldn't help but fall in love with him if you were female, and probably want to have a beer with him if you were male.
To me, he was more of a musical performer than he was a rock and roll performer, because he had that ability to act the words, act the lyrics, but without acting. He was probably closer to people like Max Wall in a way than he was to Mick Jagger, because he had that certain element about him that made him not just a strutting rock and roller, but a real character actor. He got into the part on stage of being Bon Scott. It was an extension of what he was and what he is, and he couldn't be anything else apart from Bon Scott, but he accentuated it brilliantly, so that you knew that what you were seeing on stage was the real thing, but you also knew that it was the real thing magnified to the nth degree. And there are very few people who can pull that trick off to an extent that everybody accepts it.
Angus, meanwhile, was coming into his own, sharing the limelight with Bon and blowing audiences away through his electric performances.
I suspect a lot of it had to do with nerves. He was so young when they started. He didn't know what the hell to do, and he'd probably been told by his older brothers, you get out there and do something. So he just started doing that. That's pretty much, I'm sure, how it really did develop, because he didn't know what else to do. He'd never, he was too young. He loved Chuck Berry, so he knew the duck walk, so he'll take a bit of that and he'll run around a bit, he'd bang his head, and it goes down a storm. So it's like, well, we'll keep on doing this then.
It's difficult to quantify what Angus is about and where Angus stands in the whole gamut of ACDC, the whole mythology of ACDC. To me, Bon in the 1970s was the heart of ACDC. Angus was its soul. There's something about Angus that makes you feel he is so important in the whole style and philosophy of DC that they, to put it in a modern perspective, could lose Brian Johnson. They lost Malcolm Young for a while, but losing Angus will be the end. They could not replace Angus because he is the soul of that band. I don't think Angus himself realises it. I don't think he understands why he's so revered and loved by AC/DC fans. He knows they do, and he just gets on with what he does. But it's that something about him. It's the spirituality he has in the way he plays his music. And I'm not talking about a religious spirituality. I'm talking about the way he connects with his music. And a lot of that, I still believe, has to do with the way that Bon Scott brought him out of his shell, the way that Bon Scott made him part of what AC/DC are all about, and a very crucial and important part. I think Bon gave him confidence.
No one was prepared for AC/DC's next album. TNT exploded into the charts at the end of 1975 and sold over 100,000 copies in Australia. Few could doubt that on record, the band had finally arrived.
TNT was really their first proper album. It was the first album we thought, you know what, the sound's there. Tracks like TNT are just still wonderful. You listen to them and they've still got that drive, that emotion. They're fantastic tracks. And this was the moment AC/DC were born internationally, because people started to sit up and say, have you heard that band AC/DC? Have you heard this album? It's great. It's got a great groove to it. It had a little bit of elements of the Quo or the Stones or even the Faces as far as British fans were concerned. It also had a certain, dare one say, punk attitude before punk actually had even been invented. DC were very much of the street, and they had a great groove, a great rhythm, and this was the album that really first brought it to the fore. And I think it made everybody sit up and think, good grief, what an improvement. Real album here.
With TNT, the band had realised their potential. Yet domestic success was not the end of the rainbow for AC/DC. The following year, the band would step into unknown territory and leave the sunny shores of their homeland behind. On signing an important deal with Atlantic Records in Britain, AC/DC decided it was time to conquer new territories and in March 1976 moved to London to begin the next phase of their master plan.
Now, with the confidence of topping the charts in Australia now, and the success that this gradual follow-up that's happened, and now it's become a monster in Australia, are you going overconfident that you can take on an English market?
Yeah, well, we are confident. Yeah. We're not overconfident, but we are very confident.
ACDC came to London and came to England with a confidence that they would break the UK. They had no doubts about it, absolutely no doubts. And I saw their first gig at the Red Cow in Hammersmith in '76. And there was a little bit of a buzz about this band who'd come over from Australia. People had heard TNT, bought TNT, an import in fact. So there was a little bit of a buzz going about this band who'd come over and were over here now and were going to tour and really make it. And when they came on stage for that first show at the Red Cow, there weren't very many people there. But they just came on with a sort of, you know what, this is the birth of a legend. We're prepared to play for you lot like you're 50,000 people because we know one day it will be, as indeed it has been. So from day one, they didn't have the problem. They'd done it before. They knew they could do it. And they also had so much confidence in themselves, not overconfidence, confidence, and immediately made an impact. As soon as they appeared on stage, that was it. The buzz grew.
The music scene in Britain at the time was on the brink of the punk rock explosion. And ACDC unwittingly found themselves being bracketed with the likes of Johnny Rotten.
When ACDC arrived in the UK, that was just the dawn of the Sex Pistols and all that sort of stuff. So they were kind of a bit confused with that, you know, in the marketplace. But I think the thing was ACDC were traditionally hard-playing band, which couldn't be said for lots of the punk bands, that's for sure. So, you know, they could clean the floor with them in terms of, you know, rocking out. They just left people, you know, speechless, really.
Right, we honestly thought that the punk and the new wave thing might sort of spoil a bit for us, but it hasn't at all, you know?
Yeah.
It was a big fad, like it's just like anything else, a big fad for a while, and there's those that are still hanging on to it. But the main thing about it is that it gives rock music a real kick in the guts, you know?
Yeah.
And we sort of, even though we started the whole thing over here, like we played here before the Sex Pistols were even sort of, you know, thought of.
Yeah.
And now we've always been there, and people are beginning to realise that now they want more than just someone up there screaming, you know, anarchy and rape and this sort of, you know, crap, you know. And we're it. Yeah. We're doing it right.
In May, ACDC released their first official UK album, the British High Voltage, an amalgam of their previous two Australian LPs. They quickly gained the support of the British music press and did a 20-date tour supported by Sounds magazine. In August, they toured Europe with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow before releasing a new album in Australia, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap.
Dirty Deeds was the most honed record they'd made to date. You know, they were starting to get on top of, you know, really making records. And so, you know, deservedly so, it was the most honed record they'd made to that time. And it contains some absolute classics. I've always contended that most of their albums are a bit bitsy. Most groups have a bit bitsy, but if you get 3 or 4 or 5 great tracks, you're really on a winner. And Dirty Deeds did that at least, you know, where the previous albums might have had 1 or 2 good single, bit of filler, you know. Dirty Deeds, it really started to come together.
Some of the early AC/DC music, despite being sort of powerful rock, is very soulful. It has to be said. And I mean, in fact, if you listen to Ride On, it's one of the most sublime pieces of blues guitar playing that you'll ever hear, and I don't think Angus has ever been accorded the credit. Big Balls is hilarious. I mean, that's just, you know, because Bon loved to write tongue-in-cheek, and nothing, I don't think AC/DC ever did was quite as tongue-in-cheek as that. Maybe it was considered a bit too simplistic, but I mean, you know, there's a rock bar down the road from where we're sat now, and it's got every Bon Scott AC/DC album on the jukebox, and Big Balls comes on all the time. People love it.
While Dirty Deeds performed well back in their homeland, AC/DC embarked on a tour playing larger venues in Britain. It culminated in the renowned performance at the Hammersmith Odeon.
Hammersmith Odeon was fantastic. Hammersmith Odeon was the culmination of the tour, and it was almost the culmination of this phase of their career. They'd made it this far to the famous Hammersmith Odeon stage, and they looked at home on a big stage. They took it in their stride, and of course Bon marching out into the audience with Angus on his shoulders, playing guitar and marching up to the circle and so forth was just fantastic. It was wonderful, and they really took to it like a duck to water. They understood what was required on a big stage. They performed, they filled the stage, And not with effects, not with gimmicks. It was with the five of them and their backline. They just filled the stage and they made a roaring, raucous sound, and everybody there just went, yeah.
In December, the band returned to Australia to begin a two-leg comeback tour. Yet the climate had changed and they were portrayed as obscene punk youths in the national media. Several dates were cancelled and even Australian Parliament began discussing their effect on the morality of the young.
Punk rock was happening. It was all the big, tabloid beat-up punk rock, spitting on audiences and all that sort of crap that went with punk, And so ACDC were kind of involved in that, or by implication in the UK. And they had never had that association in Australia, but, they went away, punk rock kind of explodes. The Sex Pistols were on the front page of the newspapers here, just as they were in the UK. Our punk band, the Saints, go off to the UK, but ACDC come back, and so in that meantime, the tabloids here have gone, oh, well, they're a punk rock band because that's what we understand now, so we're going to hound them as a punk rock band. And that was it. I mean, the media was after some punk. It's just really that simple. The media was after some punk rock sensation. By this time, Angus had introduced his kind of, his mooning routine. I mean, ban them for that. Oh, it's fair enough, really, when you think it's disgusting. Yeah, so it was just nothing. It was a total beat-up. And it was actually something that really served to alienate the band. They really did feel, this is tin pot. And they went back to the UK and said, well, we'll leave that behind us now. It's a really small pond. And they were right, I think.
The band remained in Australia to record their next album. But after performing gigs in February 1977, this incarnation of ACDC would never officially play live in their homeland again. "1977 would be a momentous year for the band. Not only did it see them tour Europe with Black Sabbath and later travel to America, it saw the release of their most honed and impressive work to date, Let There Be Rock.
Let There Be Rock is my favourite ACDC album. Just shading Highway to Hell and Power Age. They're all great from that era, but Let There Be Rock's personal favourite. What they did, they made another leap. It's interesting because they made the leap to Dirty Deeds, which put them on a much more of an international scale. I think with Let There Be Rock, they made an album for America. Not excluding the rest of the world, but they looked at America and said, we've really established ourselves in the UK, America is next, and we have to make an album that's going to really get the point across. And from the title track through to Crab City in Blue, all the album is aimed at America.
Let There Be Rock, I reckon, is their best album. It's my favourite ACDC album, and it was the second last one that George and Harry did, I think, at that time. But look, yes, Let There Be Rock. Conspicuously, one of the things that's kind of happening there is Let There Be Rock marked a bit of a shift where they became, that was more like an album band album. Well, Highway to Hell is a great album, and so is Back in Black. But Let There Be Rock was the first one where they made an album that just hung together perfectly like an album. And the title track, Let There Be Rock, is just, it's one of the great sort of rock tracks of all time to me.
Let There Be Rock itself is very much about the birth of American rock and roll. It was great, and it's such an epic and a tremendously climactic song. But the whole thing was they moved up another gear. With every release, they were moving further forward.
In July, the band embarked on their first US tour and continued their tradition of playing anytime, anywhere, starting at the very bottom with the goal of getting to the top.
They had already succeeded in the UK, they had succeeded in Australia, they had a fan base in Europe, but America was the big one. And they understood from day one, if you're going to do well in America, you don't go over and play New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, and about 5 or 6 other metropolitan centres. You go and you tour. You play everywhere. You go and play to the Hicks. You play the Backwoods. You go everywhere in America. You do every tour possible and get yourself across. And they worked very hard for a few months and didn't stop. And they went out there with a determination, we're going to come home with a foothold, or more than a foothold, in the United States. And they did it. And that's their work ethic.
ACDC had a very strong working class ethic. And their working class ethic was that they were on the road to garner fans around the world, and they believed, and rightly so, the only way they would do it is by live performances. Because they were, a fucking good rock and roll band. End of story.
During the first leg of this momentous tour, they were approached by Kiss bassist Gene Simmons to support his band on tour later in the year.
He came along to our show or one of our shows in the Whiskey in Hollywood to see us play, you know, and he come up to us and said, "Look, I dig your band, and we're touring in December, and we'd like you to tour with us." You know? And they played to 80,000 people.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're huge.
So the show should be quite amazing.
The tour was a success, and playing with such reputable acts gave the band a platform through which they could increase their growing fan base. On their return to Australia, they recorded Power Rage, another raw, brutal classic.
It kicks ass. It's probably the best Bon Scott album. You know, as good as Highway to Hell is, and it's a great record. Power Rage is the definitive Bon Scott statement. They're all smoking. The band are on fire. I mean, I bet it didn't take long to record. I think they must have just gone in that studio and just cut loose. And you can hear it. It's got a frantic energy to it. And there's one throwaway song on that record at all. It's just, for me, every single song absolutely nails it. It's just terrific fun to listen to.
The album was their most commercially successful so far, and ACDC decided to return to the US to keep up the momentum, playing with the likes of Alice Cooper, Aerosmith and Van Halen. It was during this 62-date tour that Bon Scott's friends and family became concerned about the singer's lifestyle.
There was always a slight edge of worry about Bon because he was a hard drinker. He lived hard. And the more on the road, as anybody who knows who goes on the road, it's a hard life. And the one way of seeking relief from that hard road is booze and drugs. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. In those early days of making success and touring non-stop, life gets tough and you get bored. And he was a hard drinker and a hard liver. I was doing a documentary about Australian music overseas in 1978, and I met with Bon in Atlanta, Georgia, and ACDC were supporting Cheap Trick. After the show, he and I went back to his hotel room, and it was just he and I, and we were talking about stuff, and I was saying, "How does it feel?" John, he was dressed to the nines. He had a long coat on, jacket, leopard skin jacket with all the trimmings, and he looked the absolute epitome of a pop star, of a rock and roll star. We went back to his hotel room, and we rang a couple of people that we both knew who lived in America and stuff, in the early hours of the morning, and woke them up, and then we started talking. We got drunk, and veritas in vino, as they say, and he started expressing to me that he thought I got the best deal because I was settled down, I wasn't on the road anymore. And he said, "I really envy that, I wish I was," because he said, to be honest, I'm really getting sick of this. He said, we're on the road non-stop and I need a break, I want a break. And he said, "I can afford to take a break, I've got a lot of cash coming my way." And he said, "I really am getting sick of this. I'm sick of being on the road. all I want to do is go out into the country somewhere. I'd like to settle down and live an ordinary life like anyone else and just play guitar." And they may have been the early hour meanderings of a drunken man who was pissed off with having been on the road for years and years. On the other hand, somewhere there, I believe there was a deep core of unhappiness.
At the year's end, the live album If You Want Blood was released, highlighting the quality of the band's playing on stage. In January 1979, they returned to the studios in Sydney, but changes to their tried and tested production formula became necessary. This album had to break them and needed something new.
Highway to Hell was the breakthrough album. It pushed everything forward. And for Highway to Hell to break through, ACDC didn't just have to write the best songs of their careers, they had to arrange them in the very best possible way, possibly better than they'd ever thought about arranging songs before. And they needed a production which would bring out every nuance, every nook, every cranny of every song. Vanda and Young weren't the people to do it. Great producers in their own right. They'd taken ACDC a long, long way. But I think everybody within the camp knew this was going to be the one to really make an impact and take up not one notch, but 2 or 3 notches. However, to do that, needed a different type of production approach.
The band left Vanda and Young in Sydney and first travelled to Miami to work with Jimi Hendrix's producer Eddie Kramer. When this also failed to work, they again moved continent and took a chance with a young British producer, Robert Mutt Lang.
They must have known how important this was because they pored over it for so long to get it right. The fact that Mutt Lang was out there to make his reputation too, I mean, that's it. The carrot wasn't far away. The carrot was really close, and they could probably all see that. And Mutt Lang coming in with a challenge to him, like everybody had a challenge, you know, and that does work.
The resultant album, Highway to Hell, quickly emerged as one of the cornerstones of rock music, and it firmly put ACDC on the world map.
The whole period that leads up to the pinnacle of achievement for Bon with ACDC, which is Highway to Hell, it's just a continuously natural progression. They were getting better as musicians, they were getting better as songwriters, they were getting more comfortable with working in the studio, so comfortable that they felt the time was right to not use Vanda and Young and to go with Mutt Lang. They must have been absolutely flying as a band at that point because, you know, they were so confident. You can hear that confidence all the way through, all the songs on Highway to Hell. I mean, it's there. You can start to hear that confidence coming through on Power Age. You know, the live album pretty much blows you away, If You Want Blood. But then you get to Highway to Hell and it's just like, you know, here's a band, they've arrived, it's their time.
Highway to Hell confirmed what many had often believed, that the band were born to play on the world stage.
ACDC became one of the biggest bands in the world in the summer of 1979. That was it. Out came Highway to Hell, they were doing major tours, they were everywhere. And they'd made almost effortlessly, almost unseen, they suddenly went from being a band who were going to be huge to a band who were huge. They were suddenly one of the biggest names in the world of rock. Everyone was noticing them.
Yet tragedy was to change everything. After huge tours in America, the UK and Europe, the band spent the Christmas of 1979 in Australia. In February, Bon returned to London to write lyrics for a new album. On the 19th, after a heavy drinking session, Scott passed out in a friend's car. He would never wake up. With a verdict of death by misadventure passed by the coroner, the world would soon come to mourn a unique icon in the annals of rock history.
We were devastated here in Australia by his death. It was incredible. It was just because you just thought Bon Scott, well, you know, Bon Scott is bulletproof, you know. Nothing's going to kill Bon. And yet, at the same time, you also know he's a live fast, die young kind of guy too. You just thought he was always, you just maybe took it for granted. And then when he was gone, no, look, the outpouring of feeling for him was just huge. And everybody knew that we had lost a huge Australian character beyond rock and roll, but just a great Australian larrikin, as we like to call them. And definitely, you know, he's gone. It's easy then for everybody to go, oh, what a great rock and roll hero he was, you know, and that definitely happened, and record sales spiked accordingly, you know.
Well, I was devastated when I heard that Bon died. Again, his wife Irene phoned me and told me late one night, and I was completely devastated. You know, he was a guy who deserved success, deserved to be happy in life. I don't think he died happy. And I also think that he was on the cusp of success and very frustrated. He was on the cusp when he died. It wasn't till after Bon died that ACDC kicked in. All their hard work for the previous 5 years kicked in 12 months, 6 months even, after Bon Scott died, when they recorded the Back in Black album, which was a tribute to Bon. That became and remains their biggest album of all time. Bon wasn't there to share it. He went out on the cusp, and I'm sure that was frustrating for him before the event, that he hadn't quite got there, that he could feel that they were on the cusp, but it's just so sad that he went out before they made it.
I cried. I just couldn't believe, and I mean, if I continue along the same veins, the tears all start now at age 56. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that Bon died. And I still can't believe that he's not with us anymore, but his spirit's with us. As long as ACDC rocks and the music rocks, I'll remember Bon.
ACDC did keep on rocking and recruited Brian Johnson as Bon's replacement. They went on to become one of the biggest bands in music history and continue to sell out arenas today. But many feel that something changed, that a part of their spirit was lost when Bon Scott passed away.
When Bon died, it was the sense of fun. Went out of the band, I think. And I think it's probably as simple as that. You know, and Brian's a lovely bloke, but he's just one of the guys. Bon wasn't. Bon was like, he was one of the guys, but he was unique. He was being the leader of the gang. People, you know, you can criticise him for drinking and taking drugs and enjoying himself too much if you want, but that's what that's what people liked about him. Because, you know, he didn't bullshit anyone. What you saw was what you got. You can hear him grinning when he's singing, even on record, some of this stuff, you know, and that it's, you know, few singers can invoke that kind of character on a record. You know, technically he wasn't the greatest singer. Who gives a damn? He had a blinding voice as far as I was concerned. So, you know, and that went out the band. You know, it pains me to say it because I love the band so much, and you know, I didn't really want to see them change that much. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and you know, you look back and some of the songs on the likes of "Fly on the Wall" and "Blow Up Your Video," they're just, you know, well, half of them wouldn't even make any of the Bon records, and the rest of them, you know, even when they seem to try and capture the essence of what they had with Bon, it falls short because it's not Bon doing it. No, you can't replicate that. It was a true one-off.
They had got to the formula. By the time Bon, if I could call it that, by the time Bon died, they had figured out what they could do and how to do it best. You know, they'd figured it out by then. So when Brian Johnson steps in, it's all like set up for it. This is how we do things. And it was kind of like that. Yeah, there's been some good tracks, but I reckon rock and roll's like that anyway. Like all rock and roll now is kind of, you know, buffed and honed and marketed, and the magic that used to happen because no one really knew what they were doing and was making up the rules as they went along, that magic has sort of really gone from rock and roll, I think, a lot now. I may be just an old fuddy-duddy, but those records that George and Harry made, you know, you cannot replicate it.
Bon's grave in Fremantle Cemetery, a site still visited by thousands of fans who leave flowers, beer bottles and messages to honour both Bon Scott and what he represented. A very real rock star, and one who will continue to be remembered.
I still, to this day, after all these years, have not met one single person anywhere in the world who didn't like Bon, who knew him. Never. I still haven't come across anyone who didn't like him. And of course, all the people, all the young kids who are into him now, who are well and truly into him, as record sales show, they think he's, you know, the ultimate rock god as well. Why is that? It has to be for what he left behind, which is his image and the words that he said and his persona. There's nothing else, there's no other explanation. Bon Scott was the real deal.
I don't think we can overestimate the significance that Bon, so, you know, I still have trouble coming to grips with it. A guy from little old Perth, still like, all the stars have got to come from somewhere. He made it so big, he's still remembered by 3 generations, not just 1 generation. And he's paved the way for so many other bands. Not just him, but I mean, he was the figurehead, and he was the personality, and he had something magical about him that captured the imagination of so many people, rock fans.
What Bon contributed to rock and roll was that he took away all the showbiz. Although he was a showbiz kind of guy, by the very nature of the fact that he was on stage, he brought an ordinariness and a slight edge of amateurishness about rock and roll to the fore. Something that wasn't slick. You know, Bon was certainly not slick. He was a rough diamond, and he brought that to ACDC. He brought that to rock and roll music, and I think that has to be one of the reasons why he's gone on and on and on.